Hi, Brett. Hi, everybody.
Hi, Kel. How are you?
I am good. Welcome to our Leadership Book of the Month, number 53, I think. 52, 53. Can you believe that? I know, crazy. I'm really excited to dive into our conversation today. The whole intention around this forum is to help leaders of tomorrow who invest in themselves today, is how you put that a few years ago. And I think it's so important to take a step back and evaluate how we're performing as leaders, and especially different times and different stages and business needs and all. And this book is a great opportunity to do that. So I'm ready to dive in. Brett, we didn't get to have a pregame. Do you want to do any kind of overview? Are you ready to introduce the book? Or
yeah, I got a few things to touch. I wanted to say thanks, everybody. I'm back this month. Last month, I got the privilege of being on your side of the conversation, in that Kelly did it solo with our author friend, Mark Harley, on the power of employee well-being. So for once a month, I was able to just sit back and be a passive listener. Really, really enjoyed that conversation. Very, very well done, Kelly. You can carry it solo anytime. So in my business, this is kind of interesting. In my business, we call this a season of moms, dads, and grads, which in food services, everybody knows. So it's Mother's Day, Father's Day, and graduation, which is kind of the lead into our busiest season. Mother's Day, for those of you who may not know it, is actually the Super Bowl of food service. Everybody takes their moms out to eat, so mom doesn't have to be in the kitchen and cook. But there's a tremendous amount of anticipation that kind of rolls into that. And then this year, we get the additional kick of having the World Cup in North America. And then Kelly and I both live in Kansas City, and Kansas City is actually hosting some of the games. So tons and tons of energy about that. The tie-in, it was Father's Day, right? And I'm a father, so got a lot of posts and call outs on social media. And one of them was particularly interesting. It was from a high school classmate of mine, and she referenced my post and my daughter and some things like that. But then she went on to say, Kelly, I follow you on the Leadership Book of the Month. And I thought, oh my gosh, how cool is that? And I'll tie a bow around that. But about the time you think that you're not making a difference, you're not making an impact, somebody will bring up a little gem or a nugget like that, and you're just moved and inspired and motivated to carry on. And I found that just so inspiring. So, for all of those that are around, and you're listening to podcasts or you're following an author, you know what? They need positive feedback just like you do. So, and just those little nuggets, those little gems, they just go so far. And I always say this, Kelly, you can back me up or not, but I say kindness is free. It doesn't cost anything. Yeah, it's wonderful.
Yeah, right.
So, so that's my little update, but thanks for that. You want to go ahead and tee up our author and our topic? And I've got a little nugget on the book, and we'll get going.
Yeah, sounds good. The reason I picked this book was that it connects to so many topics that I talk with clients about all the time: the culture and psychological safety, leading through uncertainty, lack of control. I had an executive coaching client earlier today, and literally today had the same conversation about confidence goes up and down depending on this person's in a relatively new role to him. And so when you're doing something new for the first time and you don't have everything that you need, so your confidence will shift and go down, and that's normal, and not something to lose self-esteem about. And which the author goes into.
Book in coaching?
I didn't today, but I thought after our conversation, I'm going to send him a copy or a link to it.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, it fits right in with him personally and with some things he's doing in his organization as the CEO. But I recognized that when the book came out, and it was on my radar. I think in 23 it came out, and so when I recognized that, and then who Peter Atwater is he's an economics guy. So he's somebody that is on the, he's a trusted advisor. Like, he'd be in the media talking about economics and how he'd view different things happening that would affect the economy. And so that's how he was on my radar. And he's, I would say he's an advisor, an observer. He's an adjunct professor, William and Mary for undergrad. Where I've seen him was on CNBC, and that's that I have that in my notes too. Bloomberg, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine. So he's somebody that had a job and was the economist. And then when he turned 45, he stepped away from that to do something that would let him be at home more and be more personally meaningful to him. And that's how he opens the book. And that's something we've talked about over the years as well. And I think that's all I had for him. That, you know, he's somebody that we like. He's not only an academic, he's had full-time regular roles as well. And now he leads a consulting firm. And it ties in with all the work I do in leadership and culture and performance and, you know, where I work at that intersection. So I'm excited to dive in, but let's do an overview.
Yeah, so the confidence map, that's our book this month, the confidence map. Kelly mentioned it, Peter Atwater, our author. So he explores what he calls the hidden roles of confidence in choices we make and why events described as being unprecedented. And he uses that word quite a bit in the book, precedent, are entirely predictable. And this is what kind of hit the note for me, is that when we go into this book, we like to think that we're unpredictable and we're spontaneous. No. We're probably a lot more predictable than what we realize. And as leaders, you look at that and you want to know, or you want to be one step ahead of everybody in your organization and people that are externally your organization, whether it's stakeholders like suppliers and customers. But if you have a high level of empathy and you're very mindful of, I call it reading the room, you can all but predict how things probably will turn out given situations. I didn't want to go down a political rabbit hole, but as I was reading the book, I kept thinking of, you know, is there an advisor in President Trump's cabinet who's reading this book and just saying, hey, if you do this, right, this is what you should expect the consumers to actually do. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So the confidence book is a book about why we do what we do, where we can trust our natural instincts, which isn't always, and then how we can find clarity in the chaos, which I really like. So he uses, can you put the graphic up, Kelly? He uses this.
That here.
Yeah. He built a quadrant graphic to kind of give an illustration to it. So we would have, you know, a ton of words, and we'd certainly talk about it. And I thought, as we were preparing, I said to Kelly, this will make a whole lot more sense to our audience if they can visualize the graphic, because the whole book is really centered around this framework, and he's got 4 quadrants. And he labels what I call the lower right x-axis, or the horizontal axis. That lower right he calls the passenger seat, and we'll get into all of this in the book. The lower left on the x-axis is what he calls the stress center, and we'll go into that as well. And then the upper left, which is the y, or the vertical axis, he refers to as the launch pad. And then the upper right he refers to as the control center. So he's got 4 quadrants, and each one of them obviously has unique characteristics. And given the situation and the dynamics of what's going on, that will determine exactly where in the confidence map that we fall. So I sent Kelly a text earlier this month that was kind of cool. As I was reading the book, I made the connection between being in service in church and the pastor literally looking you in the eye and delivering a sermon that you just need at that moment in your life. It doesn't happen all the time, but it happens once in a while. And in those, I call them, they're almost like Zen moments where the 3,500 people in the sanctuary are non-existent, right? They just disappear, and it's you and the pastor literally having a conversation. The point I'm making is this book kind of spoke to me like that, and it just kind of met me where I'm at, if you're familiar with how that term is applied. I needed this book right now, and it really brought clarity to so many things that I'm dealing with right now in my professional life, none of which are bad. Don't misconstrue any of that. Everything's great as far as that goes, but just having some sense of clarity and control in what's, as Peter Atwater says, is a very chaotic situation, I thought was very interesting, and I had to share that with Kelly.
Yeah.
So he uses a whole bunch of world events, and that's really what the framework is. So things like COVID-19, you know, you can imagine where the society, consumers, customers, businesses went before the event, and literally in the framework of a week, you know, where they went to after the event. And you kind of compare and contrast those two situations. He talks about the 2008 tech market bubble, the Boeing MAX 787 issues, the 9/11 terrorist attacks, Russians' invasions in Ukraine. He kind of goes on and on. So those are kind of big world events that, you know, impact society in a bigger level. And that's, he's a social scientist, so that makes perfect sense. And then he takes all of those situations and he kind of takes them down and applies them to you as an individual, or me as an individual, and say, hey, if you're in this situation, this is more than likely what you're feeling, and possibly, you know, where you are on the confidence map. Anything to add to that, Kelly?
Yeah, I wanted to just make sure people saw the axes. So the the author, he talks about confidence. Everything related to decision making comes to confidence, and it's external. So people confuse it with self-esteem, which is internal. And I often say self-esteem is if we like ourselves, and then confidence is if we believe in ourselves. And so he says confidence is going forward, and it depends on two things: how certain we are about the circumstances or the future that we envision, and how much control we believe we have in creating that vision. So control goes up the vertical, and uncertainty is along the horizontal axis. So for the map, if you just think about certainty and control lead to confidence. And so the situations that things change in society and the environment, and then with people personally as well, all of those factors affect people's confidence. And then they're bringing that into the work. And so leaders can impact that in how they communicate and how they position changes and new things and all of that. So I just wanted to make sure people had that connection and could see that control and certainty lead to confidence.
You nailed it. Yep, you did.
Yeah.
All right, let's dive into the comfort zone, upper right. Okay, so what's going on in the comfort zone? And Kelly hit it right. Confidence goes on. We're relaxed. We're optimistic about what's ahead. Think about what's going on in the business environment. Businesses are hiring. Consumers are making long-term plans, buying houses. This was particularly interesting how he illustrated the difference between booking vacations, and he talked a lot about cruise lines and places like that. If you're confident, again, comfort zone, right? If you're confident, you feel pretty good about booking a vacation that you're not going to take for a year from now. So imagine that, right? You've got to be confident and comfortable in making that commitment. Same thing with buying a house. He illustrated it several times about how consumers will tend to buy the most house they can afford, and they're betting almost on the fact that their wages are going to go up and they'll continue to earn what they're earning, but they're very, very confident, right? Their friends probably aren't getting laid off. People are probably getting bonuses and promotions. You look at all that goes into that. And I kept going back, and he never did say this, but I kept thinking of the consumer confidence index because it kind of all makes the same thing to me. So, and obviously the government reports on the consumer confidence index. And then we have to think as leaders, right? What does that mean for us? What are we probably going to do? We're going to invest in plant, property, and equipment. We're probably going to hire on our payroll. We may make a long-term capital expenditure that maybe we wouldn't have if we weren't in that comfort zone quadrant of the confidence plan. So think about that and then compare that to the lower left. But before I leave the comfort zone real quickly, I want to make sure that Kelly's got an opportunity to chime in there.
Yeah, I think key on the comfort zone too, he talked about cognitive ease. So things come easy to us when we're in that zone. And it sounds all great, but this is also when companies sometimes will take it for granted that things are going to stay the same, and that the financials are going to just keep going at that same rate. And so that's sometimes companies rest on their laurels when they're in that stage. And then that's when a disruptor comes or a competitor comes. So it's nice to be in there, but you still have to be paying attention. And I've seen so many companies that do that rested, just took it for granted. Everything was going to be the same. And then, within a couple of years, they're done. So
former CEO at Seaboard Corporation, Steve Bresky, God rest his soul, he made the statement, and he lived this mantra. He said, "We manage the business every day if it's the last day. And as long as we continue to do that, we'll never have a last day." And he was very nonchalant about it, but he truly did. I mean, he walked the talk and he lived that. And to your point, oftentimes we know we should be doing these things, but there's that safety net, there's that barrier, there's that comfort zone. Again, pun intended, that just says, what we can worry about that tomorrow, or we can worry about that next month, or we'll get to that in due time. And then you find yourself, as Kelly pointed out, maybe not in the comfort zone, but in the stress center. And you know what? Now those decisions are being made for you. We have a saying in business all the time that good times make bad times and bad times make good times.
Oh, that's good. My other concern in the comfort zone is when you're in that zone for a while, the risk tolerance goes up and the scrutiny tends to go down. And when scrutiny goes down, then that's when ethics can get a little blurry, and people can take it for granted that, oh, this will be just a one-time thing. And let's see, he said, people believe they're invulnerable, and so then opportunities for unscrupulous behavior, unscrupulous ways to get profit come in. That's how he worded that. So
as you shared that, the word that I kept coming up to my mind was tolerance, right? When we're in the comfort zone, our tolerance is probably much, much greater than if we're in another quadrant.
Yeah. And then I often say your culture becomes the worst behavior you tolerate.
That's
So
true.
when times are good and you're in that comfort zone, then the guardrails go down, the scrutiny goes down. So then you're accepting behavior that you wouldn't normally have accepted. So it's something to be aware of in that zone. Okay. Do you want to go on to another one?
Well, yeah, let's jump over to the stress center. So this is where we feel powerless, right? We lack control. The future feels uncertain. We're probably not buying a house. We're probably not booking a vacation. We're not spending on big ticket items. In my business, the thing that always gets hits, we always think of away from home dining as being somewhat discretionary. And if I'm in the stress center, I'm probably not spending money at any of the big ticket steakhouses. And my business is heavily dependent on consumers, obviously dining out and away from home. And as I put this together, I was thinking to myself, think about what we just came out of with the Iran conflict. We didn't know from day to day what gas prices were going to be. We didn't know exactly from day to day how Iran would react or how they wouldn't react. Frankly, we didn't know from day to day what our president and our leadership in Washington was going to do. So there was a lot of uncertainty. And by definition, that uncertainty puts all of us, the constituents and the citizens of the United States, in the stress center. So, and again, the key words there being powerless. I mean, I think we can all agree to that. And again, nothing we can really do about it. So from a business manager, right? People are potentially getting laid off. Customers are canceling contracts. Consumers are pulling back. It's a very, very awkward situation. And then you look at the things that have happened, and he makes reference to many of them over the last 20 years. And I talked about them in the opening, COVID, for example, obviously very, very traumatic. The tech bubble, the housing crisis, 9/11. You can just go on and on and on about these little disruptors. I always think when I hear things like that of Warren Buffett, who says, there will be five to six times in your entire life where you will really, really be able to make a lot of money. And it's when those times of disruption where the economy and society is probably in the stress center, right? And if you're prepared, there's an opportunity, obviously, to capitalize. Anything to add, Kelly?
Yeah, I think that in the stress center, when you have low control and low certainty, then that's when people feel extra vulnerable. And so then our guard is up, but that's when we also could end up following a leader that we wouldn't normally follow, or we're so panicky that I think he uses that word too, crisis and panic mode he uses a lot. That comes into play. And then sometimes leaders, the leader might be in the comfort zone and be fine, but they don't realize that the employees are in the stress center. And that particularly happens when I've seen it, has been with mergers and acquisitions. And the leaders are a step ahead because they know ahead of time what's planning and what's coming. And meanwhile, the employees don't know. And even I went to the dentist recently, and the gal cleaning my teeth said something about big changes are happening there, and they're growing their practice and all. And then I said, well, how do you feel about that? And she said, yeah, it's a little scary to not know for sure where I'll work and how it's going to be and who our boss will be. And, even in that kind of environment, that's a relatively small office and small organization, they have that same thing. So the leaders tend to be in the comfort zone and not realize how the employees are feeling. So that's right. One thing to watch out for there. Let's see if I had any others. Oh, and also in the stress center, companies and leaders are often thinking about, oh, we just need to get through this. We'll get back to normal. How often do we hear that? We'll get back to normal. I remember that during COVID, everyone's saying that. And some of us that do the same kind of work I do, we were in the back going, yeah, it's not going back to how it was before. So most of the time when you make it out the other side of the stress center, which we always do, you make it through, but you don't go backwards. So instead of reflecting on that or wishing for that, keep your head looking forward and see where can you go now. So I think those were some good points that he made in the book.
I agree. So the comfort center, or the comfort zone rather, and the stress center are kind of opposite spectrums. And those, I consider those to be the extremes, right? You're either one or the other, but there are alternatives on the quadrants, as Kelly's showing there on the screen. Obviously, if you're in the comfort zone, things are going great, right? If you're in the stress center, I don't want to say things are going terribly, but there's certainly opportunities for improvement. Let's call it that. So yeah. I'm expecting that the listeners are picking up on my enthusiasm, because I really, really like this book. I don't love them all as much as I really like this one, but boy, this one just really struck a nerve in a great way for me. So I hope that's coming through. So, it's the control freak in me who's trying to continuously looking for answers and trying to find explanations, which answer the question, why? Why did I do this? Or why did I feel that way? Or why do consumers behave in the way which they did? I'm always asking that. And I had a CEO that I was with earlier this morning, and he says, I try to remain curious. The guy's 62 years old, and he's been running the business for 40 years, but yet he's still curious, right? And that's kind of my mindset as well. And the book helps answer some of those questions. So let's consider how those plays into actions of both government and business leaders in their next move. And that's kind of what I was referring to with President Trump and what's going on in Iran. So I've got Annie Dukes thinking in bets, and I started to kind of think about, hey, is this a form of gambling? Are we betting on that? I've got it on the bookshelf. I haven't read it yet, but I'm going to move it to the on deck circle. He quotes Annie Dukes in the book, and he heavily cited Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. And so I had to go back and look, because I knew Kelly and I had covered that. Believe it or not, Kelly, that was back in March of 2026. Over 2 years ago, we covered that. But that was one of the books that Atwater quoted a ton.
Yeah, so, several times. Yeah.
So whether you guys know it or not, my co-host Kelly, she maintains our website, the links, all the conversations with the authors. And, I only periodically look there, but I had to search for when I was thinking fast and slow. And it's amazing, at least it was to me, to go onto the website and see all the material that we've covered over the last 4 or 5 years. And it's certainly a passion project for me. I know it is for Kelly as well. But I mentioned earlier about the little Father's Day social media shout out. And, those things are so inspiring. So, Kelly, you got the link up there. Great. So anybody who's looking to go back and see some of those broadcasts, those conversations, they're on Kelly's site. We've also got them on LinkedIn, and they're also on YouTube as well. So let's switch to the passenger seat, right? That's the lower right quadrant along the horizontal x-axis. And he calls that the passenger seat. Tons and tons of illustrations. I had a hard time not letting the passenger seat kind of dominate my thought, because it's one that there are so many illustrations of that. So it certainly increases, and we have less certainty is what happens. So certainty increases, and we have less control. That's what happens in the passenger seat. He uses the illustration, which I think is probably pretty applicable to being a passenger on an airplane, right? And if you think about it, you go to the airport, you get on the airplane, you sit down, you buckle in, and then you have to ask yourself, in that given situation, how much control do you have? And I started to think about, how flight attendants function and behave post 9/11 and those kind of things. Kind of went down a rabbit hole there in my head. But really what you're doing, you're sitting in that seat, you're buckling in, and you're handing all control over to the pilot and the crew to safely deliver you to your destination on time and safely. So you're reasonably certain, and I think Atwater quoted that airline travel is 99% safe, which I would probably agree with that. But a high level of certainty, but you personally have very, very little control, and that really defines his part of the quadrant lower right as being the passenger seat. Kelly?
Yeah. He talks in there too about when we are in the passenger seat, we follow and we focus on compliance. And then he even does talk about authoritarian leadership can come into play. We're more susceptible to that. Like, oh, that flight attendant must know more than me. And so we just follow along. On the airplane, there's only so much we can do. But in other circumstances, the business leader that has the most charisma, sometimes that's who everybody starts to follow, but that's not necessarily the person that knows the best route to go for the organization. So I wanted to caution about that. And then in this chapter, section, he talks about confidence elasticity. And that's the point of confidence goes up and down and it fluctuates. And he talks in there, which I won't go into it here, but there's ways to use that to your advantage to improve results. So another good point that he makes in there.
Well, and think about all the scenarios where you personally are in the passenger seat, right? Obviously, the airline, that's one. My mind went to you have a family member or maybe even yourself, and you have a health challenge, and you go to the doctor, and you voluntarily, literally put your life in another person's hand. The ultimate passenger seat experience. Think of going to an attorney, going to a doctor, going to an accountant. You literally turn your taxes over to the accountant and you hand over all control, high level of certainty, because obviously they're certified, they're credentialed. And he even used the illustration of a plumber, right? I've got it. We'll talk about that here in a minute. But these are all examples where we as individuals basically turn over control for certainty. We trade that, but we find ourselves on the comfort or the confidence map. We have confidence, but we lack control, but we have a high level of certainty. That defines the passenger seat. All right, let's move on. So the upper left, we're going up the horizontal axis. The y-axis is called the launch pad, and I found this one kind of interesting as well. So just the opposite of the passenger seat, where we have high control but low certainty. In other words, we control everything, but we're not exactly certain about what the future lies. So this is kind of what I call where we grab the wheel because we lack certainty, and I want to have control. I want to hang on to something, and we have the urge to do whatever we can do to impact an unknown outcome. We often say business, focus on what we control. Who hasn't heard that, right? So sound familiar? Said this is the launch pad. So what do you want to add on the launch pad, Kel?
Yeah, I think as an entrepreneur, and we've talked about this over the years, that's often where we live. And let's just give this a try and let's go. But that's not a fit for everyone. So, there are other vendors that you might interact with, customers, potential employees. Everybody isn't going to warm up to that. So that's something to keep in mind. And he talks a lot in this one about the narrative and the stories that you tell, and then the stories you tell yourself too. And the stories that we tell ourselves contribute to our confidence and how much control we think we have, or certainty that we think we have. And then all of that affects our behaviors. He talks about actions become feelings, become stories. Then those stories contribute to actions as well. And then something I noted, and I have my notes are on napkins, that self-doubt leads to one person's doubt leads to doubt by the whole group, by collective doubt. So that's why leaders need to recognize how other people are feeling during all of these stages.
So we've got 4 quadrants: the comfort zone, the stress center, the launch pad, and the passenger seat, right? So I had a CEO who I worked with, and he was fun. We'd get in an ELT meeting and we'd get through all of our presentations and our business updates, and he would take all that in and he'd kind of look around the room, and then he would just take a breath and he would say, so now what? And as we got to this point in the conversation, so now what, right? Yeah. And I'll never forget the first time we went into that meeting and he did that. The next meeting was much, much different, but we didn't know what to expect. So it was kind of fun. So now what, right?
Now what?
So, yeah, exactly. So the quadrants explain how we feel, and who hasn't read or heard or studied the importance of feelings, right? I know that's kind of a soft subject, but it's true, right? Employees, consumers, customers, suppliers, they really behave and they respond based on how they feel. And that's the important sentiments that play a significant role in what we do next. So let's apply this to my business personally. I'm always looking for a real world application that illustrates the concepts and principles that we unfold in the book. So I make a contract. This is a real world example. I make a contract with a customer to supply products to their restaurant. That's a given. That happens. That's what I do all day long. I personally don't make any of the products that I supply. So I make a contract with a restaurant, and I could name names, but I don't make any of the products. So at that point, where's the buyer, right? The buyer is saying, hey, I don't have a lot of control right now, but I have a high level of certainty that Mr. Gsell and his company and his suppliers can deliver product to my restaurant. So where is he on the grid, right? He is in the passenger seat because he's given up control and he's reasonably high in certainty. So I've got to supply the product based on a specification at a price and the time that's agreed to in the supply agreement. Pretty simple. So then we say to ourselves, what was the motive, or what caused the buyer to really take the product to market? And typically, hey, they're having a service issue. In other words, the current supplier is not filling their order. Maybe they're having a challenge with price, or maybe the product quality isn't quite what they're expecting based on the supply agreement. So in that scenario, the buyer, the decision maker, is probably not in the passenger seat. Where would they be, Kelly?
The stress center? Or
You got it. You got it.
yeah.
The buyer is in the stress center. And as by definition, everybody's probably thinking to themselves, they don't want to be in the stress center very long, right? So they
Right.
call Mr. Getzel and they say, hey, we need your help. I call that a motivated buyer. And in my
Yeah.
business, there's no one harder to convert than a buyer without motive, or that obviously isn't having a challenge or an issue. So, but anyway, so the buyer is in the stress center. They come to me. They want to be in the passenger seat and give me control. And then once I validate their confidence in me and I supply the product basically on time and in full is the term we use, then where does the buyer move to, Kelly?
Yeah. Then the buyer moves to the passenger seat.
Nope. They go from the passenger seat up to
from the comfort zone.
You got it. You got it. So we can see in this illustration, and it's a real example that happens, where a buyer moves through 3 of the quadrants in a relatively short period of time. And then I started to think about it. You could actually go through different quadrants in the frame of a day, right? Just by what happens through the illustration that they used was a busted pipe. So think about this, right? You get up in the morning, you have a busted pipe in your house, you're in the stress center, right? So you call a plumber comes over, they're the expert. So now you're in the passenger seat because the plumber's fixing your pipe. The plumber fixed the pipe and he leaves. Now you're in the comfort zone. And all of that happens, maybe in the framework of about 3 or 4 hours. So it's really interesting when you start to visualize how you feel, and you can see you as well as society and consumers and people in your circle, how they move around the quadrants throughout the course of the day based on what the situation is. I find it fascinating.
So fascinating. And another couple of elements of it, or ways to use it to I forgot if you call it pre-diagnose, pre-plan, or I forgot what the word he used, but to before you make a change, and you could do this for your customers right now. You can map out the journey you just put. Where are they before they buy our products? Where are they before they work with us? Where are they during the sales process and onboarding? And then when they're a new customer, where are they versus when they've been here for a year or 2 years? When they've been here 5 years, they're in the comfort zone. There's a chance that they could leave, right? So you still have to pay attention to them. So diagnose the journey that they're going to take, and then pay attention along the way, and then diagnose your stakeholders as part of that journey as well. So your stakeholders could be in different places than your customer. And so your awareness of that will help the leader influence how everybody else is feeling and handling the stage that they're in. So that was one of the ones. And then another fascinating aspect he brought up, mapping this for yourself and where you are with your customers. And you can map your competitors too and see where are they, and then compete on the right things. So if your competitor's in a different quadrant, he used in the book the example related to plumbing, the Lowe's versus a local plumber. So Lowe's is in the passenger seat. The customer would be in the passenger seat. They just want the Lowe's person to come in with all the equipment. Oh no, sorry. The plumber is in the passenger seat. The customers are in the passenger seat for the plumber. They just want somebody to come in and take care of it, fix the issue. But the do-it-yourselfer that goes to Lowe's or Home Depot, they're in the launch pad. So the plumber then competing with Lowe's isn't the right. They don't need to compete based on, or they need to know what they're competing based on. And I thought that was a fascinating use of
great illustration, that DIY thing that he talked about.
Yeah. I thought that was
one additional illustration on the launchpad, which I love where you were going with that, Kelly. When I started early in my career, I was a plant supervisor and I had 60 plus people that reported to me, and kind of a rural area. It was a manufacturing processing facility. And I was pretty tone deaf to, the human side of business. I always say if I would have been my boss, I would have fired me. I was a pretty poor supervisor. I just lacked training, and I lacked a good sense of people at the time. But thank goodness people saw promise in me and in a future. My point was, as I look back in retrospect, I would have at least one employee, and this happened almost every Monday, would come in and they'd say, I quit. And when they quit, they quit. There's not much you can do about it. We do an exit interview, and during the exit interview, we'd find that they'd had some, I guess, a challenging weekend, I guess is the best way to put it, whether it was with a spouse or a family member of the law, whatever the case may be. But they quit. And inevitably, what we would notice is, 2, 3, 4 days go by, and we were one of the largest employers in the area. By about Thursday or Friday, they would be second guessing their choice to quit. And they'd give us a call back and say, maybe I thought too soon. My whole point in retrospect, as I reflected on that, was what did they want? They were in the stress center, right? They'd had the challenging weekend. And what did they want to do? They wanted to get out of the stress center and get to the comfort zone. And in order to do that, they were going to exercise control by moving up the y-axis to the launch pad. And they were going to say that I don't control all the people around me, whether it's my family, the law, whatever. But what I do control is my relationship with my employer. I've got control, and I'm going to demonstrate control in the launch pad with the expectations, obviously, of moving to the comfort zone. But as you and I pointed out, Kelly, that's unknown, and they probably made a premature decision, and probably not the best one for them. But my whole point was, and I still truly believe this, all of us are wired, at least to some degree, to want some level of control. Obviously, the comfort zone is, kind of paradise, if you want to think of that, or that's ideal, and it's how we get there. But anyway, my point is this idea that in this time of stress, when you're in that stress zone, you're going to go one of two ways. You're going to go to the upper left to the control, right, to the launch pad, or you're going to go to the lower right to the passenger seat. But obviously, nobody's going to want to sit in the stress center for very long. Anything to add to that?
And we do sit in the stress center and we start telling ourselves stuff because we don't know. We don't know what's happening, or we don't have our vision of the future solid with this uncertainty. The vulnerability then kicks up high. We start telling ourselves stories that aren't true, but they prevent us from taking the action that's needed. And companies do that too. It's not just individuals, but companies do the same. And that's something that we can look to take a step toward.
So I'm guessing that everybody on our call is probably familiar with the term method actor, which is just a method, really. And I'm somewhat like that in that I read the book each month, and then once I've read the book, I dog-ear things through the month. I know Kelly's a big fan of tabs. She usually shows us her book with all the tabs. Yeah. And then I go back once I've done that, and I kind of highlight key points to make sure that I hit them in our conversation. But I hope everybody could sense I was certainly energized by this book. I think it lends a lot of clarity to the why, both for me personally, as well as those around me and how they respond in certain situations. So it's this idea that we're much more predictable. And I kind of referenced that at the open, that we're much more predictable than we realize. And, we can likely benefit from both recognizing that and then also anticipating. And I think Kelly did a good job of illustrating that. So we're both, and I think the point I'm making here, we're both pretty simple and complex all at the same time, if we can agree to that. So, it's that time. Unfortunately, I'm looking at the clock right now, 37 minutes in, and I think I could talk on this book for about another hour or so.
I know. So good.
We're kind of at the end of our time. So, we always kind of end with, hey, would we recommend this book? And I kind of let the cat out of the bag early. I would. It's going to hit some people a little bit differently than it's going to hit others. I'm fascinated. I'm one of those people that could put 20 people in a room and sit outside them and be a bubble and just kind of watch them behave and watch them interact. I love the study of human interaction, that study of human behavior. And that's kind of where Atwater went throughout this book, is studying how people react, how people respond. So again, it hit a really positive note for me. What's your opinion, Kelly?
Yeah, I would recommend it as well. I recommend it to people that if you can recognize that your confidence goes up and down, this will give some parameters around that. So you can feel okay about that happening and then have some ideas of what to do. But I especially want to recommend this for senior leaders. He gives specific points about what senior leaders do throughout the book. And he points out where there are several blind spots for senior leaders. And he doesn't make a big thing about it. They're not big sections, but he works with senior leaders too. And he recognizes where there are things that they do that cause confidence to go down for themselves, for other people, and for their customers. So I would highly recommend it, especially for senior leaders.
So Kelly did it at the open, but we always try to weave our mission statement, our why statement into our conversations. And she nailed it. It's right. To inspire the leaders of tomorrow to invest in themselves today. Kelly knows me well enough. I am certainly a left brain person. I do not have a creative bone in my body. And that why statement, that theme, that message, our anthem, if you will, as Kelly pointed out, we're going on, I think, 5 years, probably heading towards 6. I know we've got our schedule and our books mapped out. And earlier in the pregame, we were talking about authors that we could potentially invite to 2027. My whole point, I couldn't help but be inspired by how well that anthem has stood the test of time, Kelly.
Yeah.
If you and I were to go back tomorrow, or we were to go back to yesterday, I guess, or even work on it tomorrow, I don't know that I would change a thing. It certainly illustrates why we're here, what we're doing and what we're trying to accomplish. So tip of the cap for you on that. But I tell you what, you can't help but be just a little bit proud of what we've accomplished, and then obviously how well that mission statement has stood up.
Yeah, and that is our purpose of sharing this. So today we did go through the 4 quadrants, and most of the time we don't give an overview of the book. We talk more about the impact that it can have and how we see it in different situations, which we wove that in today. There was a lot that we didn't get to from the book as well. And I'm going to resist going into it, or we will be here for 2 or 3 more hours. But there's definitely more to the book than what we went into today. So
this is one of those that I could see myself going back and rereading it every once in a while. I'll find the book, and the concepts were new to me the first time through, and now that I've got a working knowledge and a conversational knowledge about the book, I could really see value in going through one. I've got friends who've read 𝗕𝗢𝗢𝗀𝗻𝗂 7 Habits 3, 4, 5 times.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
There's just certain books like that are that you need to reinforce the concepts because they're never changing. They're almost table stakes.
And I think this is one that something will hit you right now, but then because of the stage that you're in, and then something different might hit you 6 months from now, or a year or two from now. So exactly. I think it's worth reviewing. Next month, our book is How to Be Bold. And so I haven't finished that. I need to dive into that. But in August, next month is a week early. It's going to be July 16th. And then August 27th, Practical Leadership. And the author is joining us for that, Janet Ply. And that was one of my favorite books. I think it came out last year. And so I'm really excited for that too. So thank you so much, Brett. Thanks for kicking us off today and for facilitating a lot of the conversation and being my journey partner for this for almost 5 years coming up. And
and you're very welcome, and I right back at you, kid. So the videos, the recordings, Voyage.com. Kelly's posted the link. They're on LinkedIn. They're on YouTube. And no, we always appreciate your comments and your feedback, your book suggestions. Anything that we can do to interact with our listening audience is just really, really fun. So know that we appreciate positive as negative, constructive, but feel free to reach out to any of us any way that and we will certainly engage and carry on a dialogue and a conversation with you. So, we end pretty much the same way every month. Keep reading, keep learning, keep investing in yourself, stay curious. As Warren Buffett says, it's the best investment you'll ever make.
Yeah, right on. Thanks, everybody. See you soon.